You always want to set up your listening position facing the short wall. You've probably heard this before, and in most cases, that's correct. But this most cases assumes quite a lot, because it does mean that your room basically behaves exactly like the theory suggests. Of course, if you've spent more than like 5 minutes in a home studio, you've probably realized that does not tend to be the case. So in this video, we're going to look at when facing the long wall actually makes more sense, and how to tell which orientation actually works best for your room. Hey, what's up? It's Jesko from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. And in this video, we're gonna bust the myth of always facing the short wall and showing you when to break that rule. Now, real quick before we get started, obviously once you know which wall to face in your room, the next step tends to be how to actually get control of your bass. And if your low end is messy and thin panels aren't cutting it, I want you to check out my premium course, Build a Better Bass Trap. I'll link it in the description. It walks you through how to design your own bass trap, how deep to make it, how the air gap works, where to place it in your room, and step-by-step instructions on how to actually build it, all while keeping your room lively with a simple diffuser design. So if that sounds interesting to you, check out Build a Better Bass Trap at the link in the description. All right, let's talk about why facing the short wall tends to be the recommendation for most studios. And it's all based on you setting up in a rectangular shaped room with pretty much fully reflective walls. So I've come up with this very simple diagram here. Front wall, back wall, and we have a half wavelength room mode building up between these two walls. Here's our head, and the idea is that you want to place your head, your listening position, in a spot that neither gives you massively boosted bass or massively canceled bass, right? So obviously if you set up right up against the wall, that's where we have a massive pressure buildup. And if you set up your listening position in the center of the room, that's where you have a cancellation when it comes to this particular room mode, this half wavelength room mode building up between the front and back walls. The ideal energy tends to live somewhere around here, right? So that's where you want to place your head. And that also is the basis of the 38% guideline, which you might have heard about. And yes, it's just a guideline. It's a starting point for figuring out where your listening position needs to go. I'm going to add in another room mode now. So this one here is the one full wavelength, right? So it's pressure, cancellation, pressure, cancellation, pressure. And now you see the first problem here. If we set up in the ideal spot for the half wavelength, then we tend to be in a cancellation for the full wavelength. So in the end, the ideal spot ends up being somewhere around there. And this actually is the basis for the kind of 38% guideline, right? That's the main idea behind setting up facing the short wall, because ultimately, if you set up in this position and you find the spot where these room modes balance out and the energy is balanced out, you end up with more space to the front wall, giving you more space for your desk and speakers. You also have more distance to the back wall. So that means any energy that comes reflecting back, when we're talking about actual kind of mirror point style reflections, they will have to travel longer. So they will be further delayed. They will also be lower in volume because they have to travel further. And so overall, their impact on the sound at your listening position is less. Now, of course, if you flip this facing the short wall, you actually have a shorter throw behind you. And the easiest way to obviously demonstrate this is to just take this whole diagram and just squeeze it together, right? And in the end, the same principles apply. The only problem is that you have less distance between you and the front wall. So you have less distance for your desk and your speakers. And also the reflection from the back wall arrives earlier. It will be louder. And so in comparison to the long throw of the room, it'll potentially cause more issues. But so here's where this rule basically breaks down. First and foremost, your room actually has to behave exactly this way, right? So it actually has to fully reflect. It has to be a rectangle. And if either of those aren't the case, the room mode pattern in your room won't end up exactly like the theory suggests. And that means your listening position will also be, or have to be, in a different spot. So some potential causes for this might be that one of your walls isn't actually fully reflective. So for example, if it's just made of a single layer of drywall, that can cause a shift in the wavelength of these room modes and thus also the frequency of them. And that then means that you have to sit in a different spot. A window behaves very similarly to drywall in that it lets low-end energy pass through. And again, that might cause the wavelengths or a shift in the actual pattern because the waves don't actually reflect off of the wall where you think it might reflect, right? So as a kind of simple analogy or a simple description here, it might look something like that, yeah? And in that case, your listening position should probably be maybe somewhere here, and then you have very accentuated, very boosted bass. But it might also have to actually be here, which is now the center of the room from a visual perspective, right? But from an acoustic perspective, you're actually still sitting in the right spot where the energy in the room modes balance out. Of course, the same thing happens simply if the room shape changes. So if you're not in a perfectly rectangular room, and the more that shape deviates from that perfect rectangle, the more the pattern of room modes will not follow the theory that you would expect in a rectangular room. And thus this whole idea breaks apart. And that means that you can't actually rely on the theory. You can't predict just by looking at the room where your listening position might have to be, or rather where the spot is where the energy in the room modes balance out, because the room modes don't follow the theory. Well, of course, they do follow the theory, but it's the fact that the theory in your particular room shape with the materials involved is so complex that you can't just figure out what it is just by looking at it. And this effect can be subtle, but it can be very drastic. And you just don't know before testing it. And that means that facing the short wall becomes an unreliable guideline. In many cases it works, but there are also many cases where it doesn't work. And if you've ever tried doing this in your room and it didn't work, this is probably why, and you know just how confusing that can actually be. So what do you do about it? Well, it means that in practice, you need to test the room for its low-end behavior before actually deciding on your listening position. It's the only way to figure out whether facing the short wall does make the most sense and how far away from the front wall you actually want to place your listening position, or whether it actually makes more sense to face the long wall because facing the short wall doesn't work in your particular situation. And that's why I created the Phantom Speaker Test Workshop. It guides you through that process of figuring out and systematically testing where the low-end sweet spot is in your room with your room shape, with your windows and doors, with the materials that your room is built from, and figure out where exactly you need to place your listening position before moving on to then setting up your speakers and making sure that you're actually getting a proper stereo triangle, a proper phantom center, a proper sound stage that allows you to mix reliably and actually hear the speakers as best as they can sound in the room as it is. Yeah, I call this the MWS, the minimum workable setup, and it's basically the smallest or easiest version of setting up a room and getting it to work for you before you do anything else. So if you want to check that out, it's completely free. The Phantom Speaker Test Workshop, I'll also link that in the description. Now, if you do end up facing the long wall, that comes with a few compromises that you simply have to live with. The first one being that you will very likely have to sit closer to the wall. Typically, that's somewhere in the kind of 3 to 4 feet range. And that's the distance you have to then squeeze in your desk and your speakers. And that's the main compromise when you have to set up that way, because you can't move your listening position further away because you're going to move it out of the low end sweet spot that is dictated by the room mode pattern. And so if this is the case, this is just something you have to accept, but it's perfectly doable. And there are speakers that work really great in this situation. And the main idea is that you want to get a speaker that is physically small enough so that you can still get as much distance from them as possible, and to play with the speaker positioning without compromising too much because of its size. I really like the HEDD Type 05, for example. Excellent speaker for its size, massively underestimated low end. And also the Neumann KH 120, again, same situation, really great speaker for its size, much more low end than you expect. But yes, you will end up with a smaller stereo triangle. That's just something you have to live with. There are some advantages as well, though. And the first one tends to be that you get to set up your speakers right up against the wall behind it. And speakers actually perform best when they are that close to the wall. The main reason being that you're basically eliminating speaker boundary interference, or rather you're eliminating the problematic parts of speaker boundary interference. Speaker boundary interference basically tends to create a cancellation notch that sits roughly around the kind of 80 to 120 hertz range, basically in a part of the low end that is really useful, that you really need. And in particular, if that notch sits on top of a room mode cancellation or a floor reflection dip, you get this double whammy that can be really problematic. But if you move your speakers close to the wall, that notch shifts up in frequency to the point where it's, first of all, no longer in that problematic bass range. But even more than that, if the speakers don't play that energy into the wall behind them in the first place because of the speaker directivity, that actually removes the creation of that notch in the first place. And that's the main advantage of putting your speakers up against the wall. You do get a bass boost as well. That's the in-phase component of speaker boundary interference, but that doesn't really tend to be a problem, because if you don't like more low end, then all you really need to do is just use the low shelf EQ on the speaker to reduce that a bit, and you're good. But in my experience, this is less of a problem than having to deal with not being sat in the right spot in your room, having that balance, that proper energy balance of room modes, because you can always just put some absorption on the back wall, even if it's closer to you. That will definitely damp that reflection and basically eliminate the issue. You always got to remember that the listening position has the absolute highest priority in a home studio, because if you don't find that spot where the room mode energy balances out, you will constantly be fighting an uphill battle, and you're already fighting an uphill battle in a small room. So you really want to prioritize that above everything else, because all the other aspects of room acoustics in small rooms that you might be facing are easier to deal with than the room mode energies not being balanced properly at your listening position. So here's what I want you to take away from this video. Facing the short wall rule is not a rule at all. It is a guideline, and in most rooms, it does work best. But you don't know until you actually test it. So that's the second thing I want you to take away from this video, is you always, always, always need to actually test the room mode pattern in your room and figure out facing which side gives you the best low-end response and how far away from the then front wall you want to sit in order to get the best low end. Basically, you want to find the low end sweet spot. And again, if you want to have a step-by-step process to figure that out, check out the Phantom Speaker Test workshop for free on my website. And then if facing the long wall actually is the answer for your room, embrace the compromises that come with it. There's no other way around it. If you choose the right speakers in combination with the right desk, you can totally make that work. It still sounds fantastic, no issues at all. If you think you're having an issue with the rear wall behind you because it's closer to you, some simple absorption tends to solve that problem as well. All right, I hope that helps you navigate this whole question of which side to face in your room. and when facing the long wall might actually make more sense. And with that, let's get back to learning to trust their ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.